Bowling was supposed to be a fun, carefree night out with friends. It was Friday, and my two best friends, Emily and Sarah, and I decided to unwind at the local bowling alley. It wasn't a fancy place, but it had charm, and we always had a good time there. That night, however, fun turned into something far more sinister. We arrived at the alley just after 7 p.m. The place was buzzing with energy, neon lights casting a colorful glow over the lanes. We grabbed our shoes and picked a lane near the back, away from most of the crowd. As we set up our game, I noticed an employee watching us from behind the counter. He was a lanky guy with greasy hair and a name tag that read Tom. I didn't think much of it at first, chalking it up to him just doing his job. The first few rounds went by without a hitch. We laughed, joked around and cheered each other on. But then, Tom started to get closer. He approached our lane with a wide, unsettling grin. "How are you ladies doing tonight?" he asked, his voice too cheerful, almost forced. "We're good, thanks," Emily replied, trying to be polite. Tom lingered, his eyes scanning us in a way that made my skin crawl. "You girls come here often?" "Sometimes," Sarah said, clearly trying to end the conversation. "Well, if you need anything, just let me know," he said, finally walking away. We exchanged uneasy glances but shrugged it off. Maybe he was just lonely or bored. But then he kept coming back, asking more personal questions each time. "So, where are you girls from?" he asked on his next visit. "Why do you want to know?" I replied, trying to keep my tone light but firm. "Oh, just curious. I like to get to know our regulars," he said with a chuckle that didn't reach his eyes. I forced a smile and turned back to my friends, hoping he would take the hint. He didn't. Every few minutes, he found a reason to come over. It was getting harder to ignore the growing sense of dread in my stomach. After a particularly intense game, I decided to get a drink of water. As I approached the fountain, I felt a presence behind me. I turned around, and there was Tom, standing way too close. "Hey," he said, his voice lower now, almost a whisper. "I was thinking, maybe we could bowl together sometime. You know, outside of work." My heart raced. I don't think so," I said, stepping back. "Come on, it'll be fun," he insisted, his eyes not leaving mine. "I have to get back to my friends," I said, turning away quickly and walking back to our lane. Emily and Sarah saw the look on my face and immediately knew something was wrong. "What's up?" Sarah asked. "Tom," I whispered. "He's really creeping me out. He just asked me to bowl with him sometime." Emily frowned. "That's not okay. Should we tell the manager?" "I don't know," I said, glancing around nervously. "I just want to finish our game and get out of here." We tried to enjoy the rest of the night, but it was impossible with Tom's constant interruptions. Finally, we decided to leave. As we gathered our things, I saw Tom watching us from the corner of the room, his expression unreadable. We hurried to the car, and I breathed a sigh of relief as we drove away from the alley. "That was so weird," Emily said, looking back at the building. "Yeah," I agreed. "Let's just go home and forget about it." We pulled up to my house, and I invited Emily and Sarah in for a drink before they headed home. As we were talking, I glanced out the window and froze. There, under the streetlight, was Tom. He was standing across the street, staring at my house. "Guys," I whispered, my voice shaking. "He's here." Emily and Sarah rushed to the window. "Oh my God," Sarah said. "What do we do?" "Call the police," Emily said. "Right now." I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands trembling. "There's a man outside my house," I told the dispatcher. "He followed us from the bowling alley. I'm really scared." The dispatcher assured me that officers were on their way. We locked all the doors and windows, trying to stay calm. Tom hadn't moved. He just stood there, watching. Minutes felt like hours, but finally, the police arrived. 2 officers got out of the car and approached Tom. We couldn't hear what they were saying, but after a few moments, they led him away in handcuffs. One of the officers came to our door. "Are you the one who called?" he asked. "Yes," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "He's in custody now," the officer said. "Do you know this man?" "Not really," I replied. He's an employee at the bowling alley. He was acting really creepy, and then he followed us here. The officer nodded. We'll take him to the station and get more information. Do you want to press charges? I hesitated. The idea of going through a legal process was daunting, but I knew I couldn't let this go. Yes, I said finally. I do. The officer took our statements and assured us they would keep an eye on the situation. As the police car drove away, I felt a mix of relief and lingering fear. Emily and Sarah stayed with me that night, and we tried to distract ourselves with movies and games, but the image of Tom standing under the streetlight haunted me. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I jumped at every sound and found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. Emily and Sarah checked in on me regularly, and their support helped, but the fear was always there, lurking in the back of my mind. The police kept us updated on the case. Tom had a history of similar behavior, and they were taking it seriously. Knowing that he wouldn't be able to bother us for a while was a small comfort, but the experience had left its mark on me. I started to take precautions. I installed security cameras around my house and made sure to never go anywhere alone. It took time, but slowly, I began to feel safe again. Months passed, and life returned to a semblance of normalcy. Emily, Sarah, and I continued to hang out, but we avoided the bowling alley. The memories were too fresh, too raw. One night, as we were having dinner at my place, Emily brought up the incident. Do you ever think about what might have happened if we hadn't left when we did? She asked. All the time, I admitted. But we did leave, and we're safe now. That's what matters. Sarah nodded. It's scary to think how quickly things can change. I'm just glad we were together. Me too, I said, feeling a surge of gratitude for my friends. We got through it because we stuck together. As the evening went on, we shared stories and laughter, the fear of that night slowly fading into the background. We knew we couldn't let one terrifying experience define us. We were stronger than that. The incident had taught me to be more cautious, but it also showed me the strength of my friendships and the importance of trusting my instincts. I knew that no matter what happened, I had people in my life who would stand by me, support me, and help me face any challenge. And for that, I was truly grateful. Bowling had always been my escape. There was something about the rhythmic thud of the ball and the satisfying crash of the pins that calmed my mind. I often went alone to the small old bowling alley on the outskirts of town. It wasn't the most modern place, but it had charm, and I loved its retro vibe. That night, however, my love for the place would be tainted forever. It was a chilly Friday evening when I arrived at the alley. The neon sign flickered, casting an eerie glow on the cracked pavement. I pulled into the nearly empty parking lot, grateful for the solitude. Inside, the familiar smell of waxed lanes and popcorn greeted me. The lanes were quiet, with only a handful of other patrons scattered around. I chose my usual lane, setting up my game and putting on my bowling shoes. As I rolled my first ball, I felt a prickle on the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. I glanced around but saw no one unusual. Shaking off the feeling, I focused on my game. A few frames in, I noticed him. A large, bald man with a goatee and tattoo sat a few lanes down, directly in my line of sight. His presence was unnerving. He didn't bowl or talk to anyone. He just watched me. His gaze was intense, unblinking, and it made my skin crawl. I tried to ignore him, telling myself he was probably harmless. Maybe he was just bored or waiting for someone. But every time I looked up, his eyes were on me. My stomach twisted in knots, and my hands started to shake. I decided to finish my game quickly and leave. As I bowled my last frame, I felt a rush of relief. I changed out of my shoes and gathered my things, avoiding looking in his direction. My heart pounded as I walked toward the exit, feeling his gaze burning into my back. I pushed open the door and stepped into the cool night air, taking a deep breath to steady myself. The parking lot was eerily quiet, I quickened my pace, keys in hand, ready to unlock my car and get out of there. That's when I heard the door to the bowling alley open behind me. I turned and saw the man stepping out, his eyes locked onto me. Panic surged through me. I fumbled with my keys, my hands trembling. I could hear his heavy footsteps approaching, each one sending a jolt of fear through my body. Finally, I managed to unlock my car and jump inside, slamming the door behind me. He reached my car just as I locked the doors. He stood there, staring at me through the window, his face devoid of emotion. I started the engine, my heart racing. He didn't move, just stood there watching. With a shaky breath, I put the car in reverse and sped out of the parking lot. As I drove away, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see him following me, but there was no sign of him. The road was dark and empty, and I prayed that I had left him behind. I drove straight home, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I let out a long breath, feeling a bit of the tension ease from my shoulders. My house was dark, and I fumbled with my keys again, desperate to get inside and lock the door behind me. Once I was safely inside, I double-checked all the locks and closed the curtains, trying to shake off the lingering fear. I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe he was just a creep, a guy with nothing better to do than to scare people. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The way he had watched me, followed me, it felt personal, menacing. I couldn't get his face out of my mind, those cold, unblinking eyes. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed threatening, every noise too loud. I decided to call my friend Megan and tell her what had happened. She was horrified and insisted I report it to the police. At the station, I felt a bit foolish explaining my story to the officer, but he took it seriously. "We'll look into it," he assured me, "but try to avoid going places alone for a while." I nodded, grateful for his concern, but still uneasy. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every creak of the house made my heart race, and I kept imagining that man standing outside, watching me. A few days passed, and I tried to go about my routine, though I was constantly on edge. One evening, I was walking to my car after work when I saw him again. He was across the street, leaning against a lamppost, watching me. My blood ran cold. How had he found me? I quickly got into my car and drove home, my mind racing. This was no coincidence. He was stalking me. I called Megan, my voice trembling as I told her what had happened. She insisted on coming over and staying with me for the night. Megan's presence was comforting, but I still couldn't shake the fear. We stayed up late, talking and trying to distract ourselves. Around midnight, there was a knock on the door. My heart stopped. Megan and I exchanged a terrified glance. "Who is it?" Megan called out, her voice steady but loud. No answer. Another knock, more insistent this time. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police. Megan peered through the peephole and gasped. "It's him." Fear surged through me. "Call the police," I whispered, my voice shaking. Megan nodded and dialed 911. "There's a man outside our door. He's been stalking my friend. Please hurry." The operator assured us that officers were on their way. The knocking continued, each bang on the door making me jump. Megan and I retreated to the kitchen, where I grabbed a knife, my hands trembling. Minutes felt like hours as we waited for the police to arrive. Finally, we heard sirens approaching. The knocking stopped, and there was a commotion outside. Megan and I stayed put, too scared to move. A few minutes later, there was a knock on the door, but this time it was accompanied by a voice. "Police, it's safe to come out." We cautiously opened the door to find two officers standing there. "We've got him," one of them said. "He's in custody." Relief washed over me, and I felt my legs go weak. Megan hugged me tightly, and I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. The officers took our statements and assured us that the man would be charged with stalking and harassment. "You did the right thing by calling us," the officer said. "It's important to take these threats seriously." Over the next few days, I tried to regain a sense of normalcy. The man was in jail, but the fear lingered. I avoided going out alone and installed additional security measures around my house. Eventually, the fear began to fade, though it never completely disappeared. I returned to the bowling alley once, accompanied by Megan and a few other friends. The familiar sounds and smells were a comfort, but I couldn't shake the memory of that night. Life slowly returned to normal, but I knew I would never be the same. The experience had changed me, made me more cautious, more aware of my surroundings, but it also made me appreciate the support and love of my friends and the importance of standing up for myself. Even now, I occasionally feel a prickle on the back of my neck, a reminder of that night and the man who watched me. But I refuse to let fear control my life. I'm stronger now, more resilient, and I know that no matter what, I am never truly alone. We had been looking forward to our Friday night out at the bowling alley all week. It was a rare chance for my friends and me to unwind after a hectic work week. The alley, an old, somewhat run-down place on the outskirts of town, held a certain charm for us, with its retro vibes and the familiar clatter of pins falling. We arrived around 8 p.m., eager to relax and have some fun. There were 4 of us: Mark, Emily, Josh, and me. We paid for our lane, grabbed our shoes, and picked out our bowling balls. Everything was going great. We laughed, joked, and engaged in our usual friendly banter. Emily was up next, and she picked up a bright blue ball we had all been using throughout the night. As she stepped up to take her turn, a man appeared out of nowhere, blocking her path. "Hey, that's my ball," he said, his voice low and menacing. We all turned to look at him. He was tall and burly, with a shaved head and a thick beard. His eyes had a wild, unsettling gleam to them. Emily hesitated, clutching the ball tightly. "I'm sorry, I didn't know," she stammered. "We just grabbed it from the rack." "Didn't you see my name on it?" he snapped, pointing to some faint, scratched writing on the side of the ball. "Give it back." Emily handed it over, her hands shaking slightly. The man snatched it from her and glared at all of us. "Next time, watch what you're doing," he growled, before stalking off to another lane. We exchanged uneasy glances, but tried to shrug it off. "What a jerk," Josh muttered. "Yeah, let's just forget about him and keep playing," Mark suggested. But the mood had already shifted. We tried to get back into the groove, but it was hard to shake the feeling of being watched. The man kept shooting hostile looks in our direction, making it difficult to enjoy ourselves. After a few more rounds, we decided it was time to call it a night. We returned our shoes and headed out to the parking lot, relieved to be away from the oppressive atmosphere inside. As we approached my car, we were met with a shocking sight. The windshield was smashed, glass shards scattered all over the hood and the ground. My heart sank. "What the hell?" I exclaimed, rushing forward to inspect the damage. It didn't take long to piece together what had happened. Among the debris, we found the blue bowling ball, now cracked and dented, lying on the asphalt. "That's Psycho," Emily cried. "He did this." Mark picked up the ball and examined it. "There's no doubt about it," he said grimly. "Look, his name is still on it." Josh pulled out his phone. "We need to call the police." I nodded, too angry and scared to speak. While Josh dialed 911, I looked around the parking lot, half expecting the man to jump out at us from the shadows. The alley was almost deserted now, and the eerie silence only added to my unease. The police arrived quickly, and we explained what had happened. They took our statements and examined the scene, but the man was nowhere to be found. One of the officers, a tall woman with a kind face, tried to reassure us. "We'll do everything we can to find him," she said. "But in the meantime, it might be a good idea to stick together and be cautious." We thanked the officers and made arrangements to get the car towed and the windshield repaired. By the time we got everything sorted out, it was well past midnight. Emily, Josh, and Mark decided to crash at my place, since none of us felt safe going home alone. Back at my apartment, we sat in the living room, the adrenaline of the night still coursing through our veins. We tried to distract ourselves with a movie, but our thoughts kept drifting back to the man and his crazed eyes. "I can't believe someone would do that over a bowling ball," Emily said, shaking her head. "Some people are just unhinged," Mark replied. "I'm just glad we're all okay." Josh, ever the pragmatist, was already thinking ahead. "We should get some security cameras," he suggested, "just in case." I nodded. "Good idea. I'll look into it tomorrow." We stayed up late, talking and trying to process the night's events. Eventually, exhaustion got the better of us, and we drifted off to sleep in the living room, blankets and pillows strewn everywhere. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing. It was the police officer from the night before. "We have some news," she said. "We reviewed the security footage from the bowling alley and identified the man who attacked your car. His name is Frank Miller. He has a history of violent behavior and was recently released from prison." A chill ran down my spine. "Do you know where he is now?" "We're still looking for him," she admitted. "But we have patrols out and we'll find him. In the meantime, please be careful." I thanked her and hung up, feeling a knot of fear tighten in my stomach. I relayed the news to my friends, and we spent the day installing security cameras around my apartment. The sense of violation and unease lingered, but we tried to carry on as normally as possible. Days turned into weeks, and life gradually returned to a semblance of normalcy. The police hadn't caught Frank yet, but the patrols around the neighborhood helped ease our fears. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, especially when I was alone. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a noise outside my window. My heart pounded as I crept to the window and peeked through the curtains. At first, I saw nothing. But then, a shadow moved in the darkness. "Mark, wake up!" I hissed, shaking him awake. He groaned and rubbed his eyes. "What is it?" "I think someone's outside," I whispered, my voice trembling. Mark got up and grabbed a baseball bat from the closet. We tiptoed to the front door, and he motioned for me to stay back. He flung the door open and stepped outside, bat at the ready. "Who's there?" he shouted. There was no response, just the eerie silence of the night. Mark walked around the perimeter of the apartment, checking every corner. He came back inside, looking puzzled. "I didn't see anyone," he said. "Maybe it was just an animal." I wanted to believe him, but the fear in my gut told me otherwise. We double-checked the locks and went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The next day, I reviewed the footage from the security cameras. Most of it was uneventful, but then I saw something that made my blood run cold. At around 2 a.m., a figure appeared in the frame, skulking around the edge of the building. It was hard to make out details, but I was sure it was Frank. I called the police and showed them the footage. The officer who came to my apartment was the same one who had taken our statements that night. "This is definitely him," she said, her expression grim. "We'll increase patrols in the area. In the meantime, try to stay indoors and keep your doors and windows locked." The days that followed were tense. We kept our routines as normal as possible, but the fear was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, constantly looking over my shoulder. One evening, a few weeks later, we decided to have a movie night to take our minds off things. We were halfway through a horror film when the power went out, plunging us into darkness. "Great," Josh muttered. "Just what we needed." "Let me get some candles," I said, fumbling my way to the kitchen. As I lit the candles and brought them back to the living room, a loud banging sound echoed through the apartment. "What was that?" Emily whispered, her eyes wide with fear. We all froze, listening intently. The banging came again, louder this time, and closer. Mark grabbed the baseball bat, and Josh picked up a heavy lamp as a makeshift weapon. "Stay here," Mark said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "I'll check it out." He moved cautiously towards the front door, and we followed a few steps behind, our hearts pounding in our chests. As he reached for the door handle, The banging stopped. We held our breath, waiting. Suddenly the door burst open, and there stood Frank, his face twisted with rage. Before we could react, he lunged at Mark, knocking him to the ground. Josh swung the lamp, hitting Frank on the shoulder, but it barely fazed him. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy book, and threw it at Frank's head. He staggered back, giving Mark a chance to scramble to his feet. The fight was chaotic and brutal, with punches and objects flying in every direction. Somehow, we managed to overpower Frank and pin him to the ground. Emily called 911, her voice shaking as she gave them our address. The police arrived within minutes, and Frank was taken away in handcuffs, still struggling and shouting threats. As the officers led him out, one of them turned to us. "You did good," he said. "You're safe now." Safe. The word felt strange after everything we had been through. It took time to process what had happened, but with Frank behind,